Fascination with amazing coincidences is part of being human. Whether or not you want to view some as being more than mere coincidences and give them the name synchronicity, there remains something compelling and exciting about them when they occur. They can give you that feeling of shivers down the spine, shaking you out of the humdrum and causing you to look at the world with fresh eyes and an open mind. The scheme of mythologized geography I outline here could be justified on various levels relating to cultural enrichment, dreamtime resonance, uplifted sense of place, and so on. But bottom line, this scheme, whatever else it may be, has given rise to an intriguing string of coincidences. The old Hermetic texts from antiquity hint at a scheme of sacred geography whereby the plan of the heavenly bodies was brought down onto the ground in Egypt. These texts say that when contemplated with the mind, the heavenly bodies of the solar system are the gods. The sun is said in these same texts to be in the center of the cosmos, while Egypt, the texts say, was made into an image of the cosmos, where the gods, the heavenly bodies, came down to dwell in their respective sanctuaries. What form might this take? I've described such a scheme in a piece called The Balance of the Two Lands, Ancient Egypt's Division According to the Ratio of Triangular Equilibrium, posted on the Graham Hancock website. And it's based on the following simple ideas. Memphis was said to be the balance of the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt. As I describe at more length in the piece just mentioned, this is true at a geometric level, based on the following. The capital of Upper Egypt was Thebes. If you take the full latitude distance from Thebes to the northern point of the delta, and then apply a certain ratio of division into equal areas, you do arrive at Memphis. This ratio is that which gives a balance of upper and lower parts of a triangle, and is also derived from halving the area of a square. It can be found by placing a circle in a square and then looking at where the diagonals of the square intersect the circle. This ratio is present in the Great Pyramid, where the King's Chamber's floor level divides the outer pyramid surface into equal upper and lower halves of area. From this, I hit upon the centre and boundaries for an Egyptian geodetic scheme. To cut a long story short, I ended up with a Hermetic scheme for Egypt based on latitude, which has the solar centre at the Thebes latitude, Thebes being the cult centre of the solar god Amun-Ra, with the delta north point latitude being Earth, and by serendipitous coincidence, the Venus latitude goes through Memphis, where there was a famous temple of Hathor, the Egyptian Venus, and Hermopolis, the city of Hermes, with its great temple of Hermes, who is the same as Roman Mercury and originally Egyptian Thoth, is in the Mercury latitude zone. Our curiosity piqued by these initial serendipities, we may then wonder if such a scheme could be conceived for other nations, not just for Egypt. Specifically, as a British citizen, my own thoughts turned to Britain. Suppose we decided to conceive of a Hermetic scheme based on the mythological identities of the heavenly bodies, with the sun at the centre. This is what I did, and I was flabbergasted by the series of synchronicities which followed when this scheme was extended out across the globe by means of latitudes. In grounding this type of scheme into a nation, first a centre needs to be chosen, the equivalent of Thebes in the Egyptian scheme. A map maker will often, before making a map, seek to establish a central meridian and with certain common types of map, use the bearing at this meridian as the basis for angles across the whole map. Because the world is not flat, a straight line on the landscape does not hold a constant bearing with respect to the cardinal directions at different latitudes. In making the map, a virtual space is created which translates the curved surface to a flat one. In this flat space, the angles are made to hold true even as the line moves away from the central meridian, with the result that the angle of the line on the map matches the bearing on the ground only where the line crosses the meridian longitude, but the further it moves east or west, the more the map angle diverges from the bearing on the ground. The usual way to choose a meridian is simply to work out the central longitude halfway between the extremes of the eastmost and westmost points of the nation. This, for example, is what the makers of the British Road Atlases did, and this is what we shall do as well. So we're interested in the eastmost and westmost points of the British mainland. These are Ness Point in the east and Land's End in the west. However, as Google Earth confirms, a straight line of sight passing through the two most evocative, mystically mythologized hills of southern England, Glastonbury Tor and Silbury Hill, when extended, goes almost exactly to East Point and also fairly close to the westmost point. So what our British scheme does, therefore, is look at the exact points where this line through the two hills meets the coasts as they now stand, and treats those exact points as the extremes, with the central meridian being the longitude halfway between the east and west longitudes. Now, as I've just said, in the virtual reality of map world, the angle of a line shown on the map is equal to the bearing of that line on the ground where it crosses the central meridian. In this case, the angle, i.e. of the line joining our east and west points and going through the two evocative hills, is the angle of the diagonal of a 2x1 rectangle, or a rectangle that is twice as wide as it is tall. Twice as wide as it is tall. So we can imagine such a rectangle on the map. Recalling that with the Egyptian scheme, the starting point was a great geodetic square, we next notice that all you have to do with a 2x1 rectangle to produce a square is to double it up, e.g. by reflecting it or rotating it 180 degrees about one of the long sides. On the British map, this square roughly encompasses the old definition of Britannia from Roman times, in the sense that it extends up to Hadrian's Wall. So we have our square, and we can find the centre, which will give us the solar latitude of the Hermetic planetary scheme. It is in fact the latitude of that east point at the eastern extreme of our line, at 52.479 degrees north. 52.479 degrees north. Working again by the Egyptian precedent, the Earth latitude will be that of the point where the line through the two Mystic Hills meets the west coast, which is 50.1017 degrees north. I could proceed straight from here to the extrapolations of the planetary scheme, but there are a couple of other coincidences to mention first, forming what I call the pyramid plan. You'll recall that in Egypt, the foundation of the scheme had to do with the balance of the lands ratio at Memphis, a ratio that is found by placing a square in the circle and then looking at where the diagonals of the square intersect the circle. I noticed that in the southern portion of the British scheme, the equivalent balance of the land's latitude is one and the same as a line joining the two famous chalk man hill figures of the Long Man of Wilmington and the Cern Ados giant. I noticed more strange coincidences connected with this. Firstly, I found an Egyptian image of a figure holding two serpents that looks remarkably like the long man with his two staffs. Then I noticed other similar imagery showing animated Ankh symbols holding two was scepters, one in each hand. I knew that one of the meanings of the Ankh hieroglyph was to bind, and that Memphis was called the binding of the two lands as well as the balance of the two lands. And in at least one of the images, the Ankh was shown in the form of a balance, or scales, with weights hanging down from the elbows. And added to that, I was aware that the use of two staffs, and indeed two serpents, to represent the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt is also found. To cut a long story short, it would be hardly a stretch to say that the Long Man of Wilmington is, within the Egyptian vernacular symbolism, a very appropriate figure to place at this balance of the land's latitude. But there was more, and this is perhaps the first of the truly extraordinary coincidences. You'll recall that the ratio of the balance in question is embodied as a division of pyramid surface area into equal area halves by the positioning of the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid. A pyramid, seen from the top, is a square with diagonals, the diagonals being the pyramid edges, and this is part of the geometry by which to generate this ratio, just by adding a circle in the square and noting where the circle intersects the diagonals. Supposing we add the diagonals to our British geodetic square plus a circle to produce the balance of upper and lower ratio. The square with diagonals could itself be seen as a plan view of the pyramid, and the balance of upper and lower ratio gives us the height at which the king's chamber is placed. To the mind, this seems to mix up two different views, the cross-section and the plan view. But we should now be seeing as the Egyptians saw, and to the Egyptian mind it was perfectly normal to mix up these two views. So, for example, a pond in a garden could be shown in plan view, with the trees surrounding it shown as if from the side, instead of the top view that you'd expect. There is a narrow shaft that extends southwards from the king's chamber up through the body of the Great Pyramid. The angle of inclination is such that, in the Pyramid Age, it was orientated towards Orion's belt at Orion's culmination at the meridian of the sky. Given that the pyramid texts speak of the deceased pharaoh's soul ascending to become one with the constellation of Orion, this orientation of the shaft has been seen as significant. And here's the thing. To a very high degree of accuracy of measurement, and both in terms of the latitude, the north-south positioning, and the longitude, the east-west positioning, Cern Abbas, itself the perfect image of the Orion constellation with his great raised club and the other hand extended in front of him, this hill figure is right at the point where the shaft starts to ascend in the southern portion of the pyramid plan. What about in the northern portion? In northern England there is a great landscape art representation of Orion's belt, namely the great Cursus and Henge complex of Thornborough. A cursus is a mysterious man-made ancient landscape feature formed by pairs of long straight banks, and a henge is a large, equally mysterious circular bank and ditch feature. The enormous Thornborough henges each take the form of double henges of concentric circular banks, and they are joined by cursuses. The three most famous ones are set just off straight alignment, just like the three stars of Orion's belt, for which reason they have been seen as a representation of Orion's belt. Surely the Thornborough-Henge complex can't be in the equivalent Orion location for the northern pyramid plan that we saw with the CERN-Orion in the south. That would be too much of a coincidence, wouldn't it? Well, it is in that location. To be precise, we're talking about rotating the whole plan 180 degrees around the centre of the square, and it is not in fact the three Orion's belt henges that are at the exact latitude and longitude location, but there are some other henges that are also part of the Thornborough complex a little further to the southeast, and some of these are in just the right place. The diagonals of the British geodetic square divide it into 4 triangles, and while the western location is out at sea, there's no reason not to ask what is the equivalent Orion point in the eastern portion. Here again, with good accuracy, an interesting site is pinpointed. Interesting because, just as at Thornborough, it's the site of a henge and cursus combination, one that passes through the town of Farnham All Saints near Bury St Edmunds. But we're getting a bit sidetracked here from the planetary scheme, which is supposed to be the topic. So let's now return to this. I won't cover everything here, but we'll present some preliminary basics for a few of the big hitter coincidences that arise out of this scheme, found by looking at the latitudes corresponding to the inner, outer and middle orbit distances of heavenly bodies in the solar system, since planetary orbits are elliptical. In Greek tradition, the Blessed Isles in the Western Ocean were ruled by Kronos, the Greek name for Saturn, for example in the writings of the ancient Greek poet Pindar. And once the Canary Islands became known to the classical world, they became identified with these Isles of the Blessed, for example by the geographer Ptolemy. And the Saturn latitude in the scheme passes through the Canary Islands. Mount Olympus is at the latitude of the middle Jupiter orbit distance. This, in myth, is the location of the great palace of Zeus, known as Jupiter by the Romans. More accurately, the Jupiter middle latitude matches the location of the great sanctuary of Jupiter in Dion at the base of the mountain. Dodona in northern Greece, the oak oracle centre of Zeus Jupiter, already sacred to this god by Homeric times, is close to the base of a mountain at the outer Jupiter latitude, namely Mount Tomaros. There are 2 groups of asteroids held in place in the orbit zone of Jupiter, collectively known as the Trojans, with the 2 groups being known as the Greek camp and the Trojan camp, and with individual asteroids named after heroes of the Trojan War. The latitudes of these asteroids in the scheme encompass the region of ancient Troy. One thinks of such events as Hector smashing through the gates with a huge stone, where the stone brings to mind an asteroid. The inclusion of such things in the scheme is not about valuing violence, but rather about valuing the great heritage of poetic literature that has, on occasion, taken war as a theme for treatment. Another group of asteroid-like objects is known as the centaurs, perhaps because, like the centaurs of myth, they are relatively unruly, in the sense that their orbits don't follow such ordered patterns. None of the average orbit distances for the centaurs is less than 5.5 astronomical units, which provides an inner boundary in the scheme with a latitude that goes through Mount Pelion, home of the most famous and benevolent of the centaurs, the wise Chiron. He held his wild school for heroes in a cave on this mountain. One thinks of stories and images of the centaurs hurling huge boulders. For example, the episode of Hercules fighting the centaurs in Arcadia, which is in southern Greece, and the centaur zone, according to the scheme, does extend down through here and beyond. As unruly asteroids, the centaurs need to be kept in check, and it was on Pelion that a battle occurred where Theseus and other heroes succeeded in doing this in the story of the Centauromachy, or centaur struggle. We ought to do the same and find ways to protect Earth from asteroids. The middle Mars orbit distance in the scheme corresponds exactly to a latitude that passes right through the Champ de Mars, or Field of Mars in Paris, that area around the Eiffel Tower where there are statues of Mars on the fine classical domed hospital built for war veterans, and also on the nearby Fountain of Mars and Hygeia. This whole area was inspired by the Campus Martius in Rome, also sacred to Mars in his benign role as protector of the peace. The Earth latitudes, outer, middle and inner, clip southeast Cornwall, the area of West Penwith, which in New Age circles has come to be known as the Land of the Goddess, and has hosted annual Goddess in Cornwall events, in which the standing stones, stone circles and megalithic underground chambers are associated with the Earth Goddess, Gaia, Mother Earth. Bosavon, right on the Middle Earth latitude, has been home to these events and to Dodona Press. Dodona means Earth Mother. Dodona have published such books as Pagan Cornwall, Land of the Goddess by Cheryl Strathon. The inner Neptune orbit goes through Lake Pupo in Bolivia. This salty lake, liable to flooding, is the location of the area identified as Atlantis by Jim Allen in books and TV documentaries. According to Plato, who's the ancient source of the Atlantis myth, Atlantis was ruled by and sacred to Neptune, i.e. Poseidon, and was inhabited by his descendants. And on the central island of Atlantis there was a great temple to this god, with a great statue of him, and groves sacred to him, and so on. The outer Venus latitude goes through Osborne House on the northern shore of the Isle of Wight, location of numerous statues of Venus, including the antique Roman marine Venus in the Grand Corridor. Venus herself was sacred to the shore as Aphrodite, born from the surf. The middle Mercury latitude goes through Cliveden House by the Thames with great accuracy. And this is the location of the classical statue of Mercury in the Arcadian grove of ilex trees, as well as the pair of genuine ancient Egyptian granite statues of seated Thoth baboons, like smaller versions of those at Hermopolis by the Nile. As mentioned, the city of Hermopolis became sacred to Hermes Mercury because it was already sacred to Thoth, who took the form of a baboon, and who was equated with Hermes as god of the mind. Indeed, Hermopolis, as we've said, is at the equivalent Mercury latitude in the Egyptian version of the scheme. The inner Mercury latitude passes very close to the famous statue of Mercury in the Fountain of Tom's Quad, Oxford, and Mercury Hermes is god of academia and of the training and education of the youth. The outer Mercury latitude goes through the southern regions of the city of Bath, and in Bath there is a large statue of Mercury on top of a building in Quiet Street. The Greek rain and sky god Uranos, the Roman Uranus, has been linked to a common ancient Indo-European origin with the Indian Varuna, the rain and water god, and also the English rain from the same Indo-European root. The Uranus latitude in the scheme goes through southern India, where Varuna is still invoked in hope of rain. Kerala, in this region, was granted uplift from the oceans by Varuna. As we know from an ancient account of a lost play by the Athenian Aeschylus, the large plain of the Crau in Provence, with its covering of small boulders, was identified by Greek mythographers as a site through which Hercules travelled when returning from his labour of fetching the cattle of Geryon. He was herding them through this region when he was attacked by bandits. He had no weapon, so prayed to Zeus, in other words Jupiter, who sent him a shower of stones to use as missiles against the bandits. He was victorious and successfully protected his herd. The boulders lying on the plain to this day are said to be left over from this shower sent by Jupiter. The latitude of the Crau corresponds in the scheme to a group of asteroids that are indeed orchestrated by Jupiter, for they move in a 3-2 orbital resonance with the planet. These are called the Hilda's asteroids. This resonance is protective for us as it keeps them in an ordered band. We don't want asteroids flying into our path in an unruly fashion. The Centaurs, by contrast, are unruly, which is why it's good that they're out past Jupiter. The minor planet Eris, chaos or strife, turns out by the scheme to rule, somewhat appropriately, the frozen icy wastes of the Antarctic. The scheme also extends north of the solar latitude. Roman archaeology from Lincoln indicates the presence of a temple of Mercury there, and a Mercury latitude runs through this city. The Fuel asteroid equates to the region Ptolemy identified with the legendary northern land of Fuel. Jupiter in the northern scheme has his latitudes on Iceland, including the Nordic equivalent of Olympus, the feasting hall of Thor at Helgafell. Thor, as oak and thunder god, is the Nordic Jupiter, which is why, for example, Thursday, which comes from Thor's Day, is the same day that in Italian and French is named after Jove's Day. The frozen sea of the Arctic Circle was known to the ancient Greeks as the Sea of Saturn, and this too fits with the scheme. Carrying on past the North Pole and way down into the Pacific, we come to Easter Island. The god of Easter Island is Makemake, also a minor planet. Easter Island isn't at inner, middle or outer Makemake latitudes, but it is within the Makemake zone lying between the inner and outer. So what's at the centre of all this? At the centre of the British Geodetic Square is the Balaji Temple, with its tower modelled on towers from temples in India. These towers represent Mount Meru, which is said to reside at the centre of the cosmos with the heavenly bodies rotating around it, which seems rather appropriate.